Good evening. It's Wednesday night. I first want to say thank you to this congregation for everything that you've done for Westview Boys Home. We loaded a car full of groceries, and many of you donated money to take care of some of their needs right now, and I know their needs are great, and I just want to say thank you. And you're a tremendous congregation. I love you so much, and I appreciate what you've been doing. I appreciate the prayers that you've been sending out as well. And I just want to say thank you, and the Westview Boys Home sends their thanks as well. Tonight we're going to be continuing our study in Daniel, so if you have your Bibles with you, go ahead and turn over to Daniel, the 4th chapter, and we're going to get to that in just a few minutes. If you think about the last 6 weeks of study in the book of Daniel, we really focused on the very beginning, the first 3 lessons about our identity, about our convictions and the decisions that we make, and it's really talking there about our identity. You know, who are we, and what are we going to do, and how are we going to react? Not actually react, but to respond in the culture that we live in, or respond to the difficulties that we have, or the sin in our lives. The next 3 weeks after that, we focused on worship. Who do we worship? And usually when we think about worship, we think about our Sunday morning time. But we talked about who do we worship from Monday through Saturday. Who do we exalt? Who do we praise? Who do we not just place our priority, but where is our focus? And we talked about that for several weeks. And now I want to shift into some things that Daniel teaches us, and some of the shortfalls that we might have taking us away from our identity and losing who we are to worship in our lives on a daily basis. And the first thing that I find, and especially in Daniel, the 4th chapter, what I find is pride. Pride is a huge factor when we can interrupt our worship to God, our relationship with God, and it interrupts understanding who we are. And because of pride, there have been so many difficulties in our life. And I want to talk about that, especially looking in the 4th chapter of Daniel. I want us to understand that there's nothing wrong with having a healthy sense of self. That's actually something that we need. That goes back to our identity. That can be very healthy, and we need to know who we are, especially in the eyes of God. But we don't need to exalt ourselves above God. And that's what happens with pride. Pride is that gateway to so many other issues that we're going to have in our spiritual life and relationship with God. It just opens that door and allows so many other things in. It's going to be that little voice in the back of your mind that says, you know, religion and church, that's something you don't need. You know what's going on. You know what you need. You know what you want. You are in control. And it's those little whispers, those little lies that are in the back of our mind. That's pride working. And if those lies can be implanted in our life, then pride will take over. We take over. We lose control. Now that go to us instead of being God in control of our lives. And then we lose who we are. If you look throughout the entire Bible, it continually talks about pride and how we need to pay attention to stay away from prideful thoughts and actions, especially through the wisdom literature, the prophetic literature, and into the New Testament. It talks about pride and how it can destroy our relationship with God. Pride is a massive problem that usually creates a chain of reaction of massive quantities, of consequences, And a lot of the consequences that we have in our lives comes from pride and allowing that to take over. It's one of those things, if you look in our culture right now, our wisdom, it just seems like there's so much strength there. And we look around at what we have created, we look around at what we have, and we believe it's what we deserve and what we built instead of looking to God. You know, it's really incredible to me. When we go to Daniel, the 4th chapter, go ahead and go there. In the very beginning of this chapter, King Nebuchadnezzar actually praises God. This is right after Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into the fiery furnace, and then they are to come out, and Nebuchadnezzar sees a fourth person in there, an angel that was with them walking around the furnace. He asks them to come out. And then he says this in the beginning of the chapter. The king of Nebuchadnezzar, to all the peoples, nations, and language that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you, as it seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders of the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is everlasting kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. And this is what King Nebuchadnezzar says right after he sees what happens in the furnace. And what I find is that we can have a great relationship with God, understand who God is, but then right after, we lose sight. And pride can come so quickly back into the picture, and we look at ourselves. And that's what's going to happen to the rest in this chapter, starting in verse 4. But there's a word there. In my translation, it says, peace be multiplied to you. In other translations that I have here, it will say, be prosperous. May you prosper greatly. And there, that prosperity means peace. It is a peace that means for our souls, a sense of well-being, fulfillment that nothing can disturb. It's a completeness almost that brings that peace. And even though we live in a world and in a culture of chaos, we can have peace in our minds. But what happens? Pride gets in the way. And that's exactly what happens to King Nebuchadnezzar. And honestly, that's what happens to us. We allow pride to come back into it. And pride is so destructive when it comes back into play. Pride declares this: I want to be God. I want to choose my own way and live as I please. And when you look at the story of Nebuchadnezzar, that's the kind of pride that we find here. And it leads literally to his insanity, but it breaks that relationship with God. And it's an inner turmoil that he finds here. God is going to warn Nebuchadnezzar about this pride. And he's going to identify 3 different areas where pride usually flourishes. And that's what I want to look at tonight. The 3 different areas where in our lives where pride can flourish. And so just follow along with me, especially through this chapter, Daniel chapter 4, and we're going to see so many things. But the first thing I want us to understand where pride was really going to flourish, where it's going to dwell in our lives, is in prosperity and contentment. It's the sense of complacency. It becomes our entitlement to enjoy life and all that it has to offer. But you see that what happens here is that complacency helps or makes us lose sight of God. Look at Daniel chapter 4 and verse 4. He says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and prospering in my palace. He was at ease at his house and prosperous. And that's what he was doing. And he was looking at everything that he created and what he had instead of looking towards God. You know, when times are good, we really don't think about God. We don't put our focus on God. We don't really become dependent on God. You know, when we're paying our bills, when the family is good, when church life is good and there's nothing going on that's bad or any strife and everything just kind of going along the way it needs to go, we become complacent. We don't put our dependence on God anymore. We kind of lose track of Him and we don't think about Him very often. To be really honest, most of us really don't know how to handle prosperity very well because we don't think about God. We don't come to God. We don't look to God. You know, usually when we turn to God, it's when times are rough, when we get served with divorce papers, when we lose a job, when we're having difficulties with our family, when we have sickness. I'll even look at our country. You know, our country hasn't been thinking about God at all, hasn't been a part of anything that we do. But now, because of COVID-19 and the things and circumstances in our life, we're bringing God to the forefront. Prayer is coming to the forefront. And we are acknowledging that we need God. And that's what we do too. When things are good, where's God? When things are bad, we need God. And what we need to do is to make sure that we don't allow our pride, when things are good, just to forget about God. and we do not become dependent on God anymore. We need to overcome our pride in our lives. I mean, we need to turn from a self-sufficiency back to a God dependency. And in those times of prosperity, we really lose our focus. So how do we keep our dependency on God? The easiest way that I can tell you is through prayer. That's kind of our lifeline to God. It's what connects us to God. It's going before God and realizing that we need Him, even when times are good. I like what Second Chronicles chapter 4 verse 17 says there, and he says, "If God's people humble themselves and pray, then He will hear us and He's going to forgive us." We need to humble ourselves. We need to pray to God, and He's going to take care of us. It's just us having the willingness to come before God. It just indicates that we're surrendering to God, that we're giving ourselves to God. And it's as simple as prayer. And I know we talk about it often, but I really believe that this is a key component to keep our dependence on God. True dependence relies on prayer and in that consistent lifeline. It's not just going through the tough times. A lot of people have asked me, John, how do I hold on to God? Where is God in my daily life? And I would tell them, what's your prayer life? The people who have success in life, they have a strong prayer life. And I'm not talking about material success. I'm not talking about perfect success. I'm talking spiritual success. That lifeline to God is prayer. The second thing I want to look at that you find in Daniel, the 4th chapter, and that will keep us away from pride. And pride will undermine our spiritual growth. It is within our attitude of getting and receiving credit, getting and giving credit. We need to give credit where credit is due. When you look at King Nebuchadnezzar, he does not give credit where credit is due. When you go to Daniel chapter 4, starting in verse 5 all the way through 21, I'm not going to read it because I'm going to read the next part into the story, so I'm going to just explain it. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. It's a second dream. Within this dream, there is a beautiful tree, a very large tree. As it says in Scripture, it will cover the earth. The branches are broad. The leaves are lush. The fruit is there. The birds are sitting in the branches. There's creating shade for all the beasts of the field. And he sees this tree. But then there's a messenger from God that comes down and he says, cut it down. And it's going to be cut down. I want to read just that one part. And he says in verse 15, but leave the stump and its roots in the earth, bound in a band of iron and bronze, and amid the tender grass of the field. He says, so this beautiful tree that's providing so much for everyone is going to be cut down. And then he's going to talk about what's going to happen to King Nebuchadnezzar. So nobody can interpret this dream. And finally Daniel comes onto the scene. He goes, I'll tell you the dream. I'll tell you what it means. And that's where I want to pick up the story, starting in verse 22. And it says here, it is you, O king, who have grown to become strong. Your greatness has grown and it reaches into heaven, and your dominion to the ends of the earth. And the king saw a watcher, and that means messenger. I don't like the term watcher there. A messenger, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave its stump and its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze and tender grass in the field, and let him be with the dew of heaven, and the portion be with the beasts of the field, till 7 periods of time pass over him. That part's about King Nebuchadnezzar. This is the interpretation, O king. It is a decree from the Most High, which can come from above, from the from my Lord the King, that you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling place will be among the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like the ox, and you shall be wet with dew of the heaven. For 7 periods of time shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. So Daniel comes onto the scene and he says, listen, this is what it means. There's this tree is you, and you are going to be chopped down. And you got to think, King Nebuchadnezzar looks at himself as a great man. And you can. I mean, he is a great, powerful man, probably the most powerful man at that time. You know, we can go back in history, and Nebuchadnezzar is the one who creates the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. Look at all the provinces and territories he has conquered. He steps back and goes, look what I have done. The tree is him. He has created this kingdom. But he failed to realize that everything came from God. Far too often, guys, we do not look to God when we should. We look around at everything that we have, and what we'll say is, this is what I've built. This is what I have created. This is mine. And it's so important for us to understand that we need to give the credit to God. But I want you to look at something here in Scripture. And he points out, there's a warning here, and what God does is point out the natural consequences of such arrogance and pride. If you notice here, it's not God just giving a judgment. I think there's more than that just here. It's not just God or a threat of judgment. What he's showing us here is the natural consequence of when we leave God and take control of our own lives. It's the result of thinking we are better than God. And that's what this is happening here. It's just incredible. People often think that God is judging me and he's bringing judgment upon me. But you know what I've learned over time? Is that a lot of the consequences that I am facing in my life right now are because of the choices that I have made, and usually because of the pride that I have. And now I'm facing the consequences of the choices that I've made. And it's not God, it's me. And I'm living up the consequences of choices. So what do we do to avoid this? The last thing we talked about was prayer. This time, you need an attitude of gratitude. I know that sounds awful, but I don't know how else to say it. An attitude of gratitude. You need to understand that everything comes from God. That the blessings that we have in this life, it comes from God. And it gives us that perspective that we need. And it restores our perspective of God. If we know God is, and that's what we talked about on Sunday, we're going to combine a lot of these lessons now. If we understand who God is, then we understand the things that we have around us, our family, our jobs, our church, these are blessings. And it renews that perspective for us. Success can really, really blind us. We think, again, like we've earned it, we built it, so therefore it's ours. I want to read 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 7. And there Paul's talking about with the church, don't be puffed up. Don't be puffed up. It's not about you, right? And listen to what he says here. For who makes you different from anyone else? What do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as though you did not? And what he's really talking about here is, what did you do? What you have is a blessing from God. What you've received is a blessing from God. And it's just us taking a step back. What have you accomplished on your own? It all comes from God, and we need to have that attitude of thankfulness to God. So the 2 lessons we've looked at so far is make sure we have a dependence on God. Contentment, that we need to be not forget God, but continue to have a dependence on God. The second thing is, let's give credit to God. Give credit where credit is due. The third thing I want to talk about tonight is our perspective. Make sure we have the proper perspective. Look at Daniel chapter 4, verse 26. Daniel chapter 4, verse 26. And as it was commanded to leave a stump of roots and tree, your kingdom shall be confirmed for you from the last time that you know that heaven rules. So what he's saying here is, you'll have your kingdom back when you understand God is in control, or heaven rules. This is the one passage of Scripture that I want to focus on just for a moment, Because what it demonstrates to us is that God always allows us a way back. Our God is truly a forgiving God. We can go back to the parable of the prodigal son, the father representing God looking down the road, trying to wait for his prodigal son, the son that's gone wayward, coming back. And when he sees him, he runs to him. We need to understand that, yeah, there might be a stump, and yeah, we might fall in our pride, and we have made bad choices, and there's consequences. But God shows us a way back, and he wants us to have a relationship with him again. Sometimes we fall under our own weight of our own arrogance, but we're forced to humble ourselves, and we need to start all over. Nebuchadnezzar had to learn the hard way, and if you're anything like me, I've had to learn the hard way as well. For 7 years, he was like a madman. He lived like a madman. He lived like a wild animal, eating the grass. He was out of his mind. He wasn't even allowed to be around his own people. But look at verse 33 now. Drop down to 33. Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven out among men and ate grass like ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair grew as long as the eagle's feathers, and his nails were like bird claws. We just get a picture of this man, and he's lost his clarity. He lost that peace. In a way, he's lost humanity. He's lost his way because he doesn't have that relationship with God anymore. And it can happen to us so quickly because we become so wise in our own eyes. We forget about God. So what I want to do here is, how do we come back to God? We look at what we've been studying so far. Continue to have our dependence on God, give credit to God, and our perspective needs to be a perspective of with God and looking to God, and not lose focus on our God, but to keep him there. Look at verse 27, Daniel chapter 4, verse 27. Eventually, King Nebuchadnezzar is going to come to his senses. Therefore, O king, let the counsel be accepted to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that they may perhaps be lengthening of your prosperity. And we find there that there's a hope for him. Now drop down to verse 34. And we're going to read verse 34 all the way down through 37. And that'll bring us to the end of the chapter. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. His dominion is everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of earth are accounted as nothing, for he does according his will among the host of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can say to his hand or say to him, what have you done? At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. My counselors, my lords, sought me, and I was established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. I now, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and honor the King of heaven, capital King, K, King of heaven. And all his works are right in his own ways and just, and those who walk in pride, listen to this, those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. What an incredible prayer. If you want to understand how to overcome pride and how to come back to God and what it looks like, this prayer is absolutely wonderful. 3 things we're going to pull out really fast, and then we're absolutely done. Go as fast as I can. Number 1, he looked his eye. Actually, now it's going to be 4. The first thing he did was looked his eyes up to heaven. He looked to God. Remember we talked about look up, stand up, and then speak up. And the first thing that Nebuchadnezzar does here is he looked back to God. And that's incredible. That gives us the opportunity and tells us that we can come back to God, ask for forgiveness, and it will be granted to us. And that's what he does. So the first thing I want to look at, what does the King Nebuchadnezzar do in coming back to God? Number 1, he exalted the king. God deserves our praise and glory. Okay, that is the first thing that King Nebuchadnezzar does. He exalts him, he praises him, and that's what we've been talking about, is who do you worship? Who do you glorify in your life? And it's got to be God. That is holding God up and not looking at us but it's not a priority. It's God is. And he exalts him and he praises him because he understands he's the King of Kings. He is God. And he exalts him. The second thing he does, he acknowledges that God does everything right and his ways are just. We need to understand that God is all authority and his word is all authority. And we don't need to second guess him. I'll be honest with you, this is something that I have a very difficult time with. I've had a difficult time even recently in my life. Sally and I were just talking and we're working out some things, not between her and I, just some life situations. And I'll tell you what she did. We have a little system. She put two chairs that was facing each other, and then she sat down in one. And I knew exactly what that means in our marriage. That means we need to sit down and we need to pray. I was so angry at the time. And I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I didn't understand what was going on. I looked at her and I said, if you want to pray, you go ahead. I'm not there. One, that's horrible thinking, especially everything that we talked about tonight. That's why we're talking about it. We're talking about prayer. We're talking about that lifeline. We're talking about not putting yourself there and not putting any worrying about this life, a dependence on God instead. When we come to this, you know what? There's times when we do not understand God's ways, and we talked about that. His ways are not our ways. He understands his ways are just. And we may not understand it. We may not know it. But God tells us you just need to obey it and follow. And if I struggle with that, I know that other people struggle with it. Giving up full control. And we may not even like it. We may not agree with his ways. We may not be happy with the way life is, but then you can take a step back and you say, God is. And what Nebuchadnezzar does is says, your ways are just. You are right. So therefore, I'm going to follow you. There's something liberating when you actually can put your faith and your trust into something that's bigger than you. And you may not fully understand it, but that's where you find the peace that you've been looking for. And it's so hard to explain. There's no words that I can use to explain this. You really need to put it into practice. And when you do, you find that God is there. And we allow God to take control and we surrender to him. The last thing there, and the third thing that I find in this prayer is humility. It's found all the way through the prayer. I do not like people who talk about humility and think humility is putting ourselves down. I'm not a good person. Oh, I'm a sinner. I've got to humble myself. That is horrible biblical spiritual study. That is not what humility is. Ugh. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. Humility is thinking of yourself less. Far too often we think humility is just trying to knock us down. We're nothing. But humility is just thinking about God more and thinking about us and our needs and our wants less, to where God fills us so much more than what we, instead of me, it's God, you, and you. And that's humility. If I told you what is the greatest commandments that Jesus teaches and God teaches in the Bible, what would you say? I'm going to give you 5 seconds. Just say it out loud. What are the greatest commandments? So most of you probably said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. What we talk about all the time is love God, love others. Love God, love others. Love God, love others. How do you love others if you don't love yourself? What? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. God doesn't mind us loving ourselves if we understand, our very first lesson, our identity with Him, understanding who we are because of God, and God shows us who our identity is. And remember, our identity is lived out in our purpose. Our purpose is lived out in our action. it is healthy for us to understand who we are in our relationship with God. And when you understand that, you actually say, it's not about me, it's about God. And we find true humility. But that's because we have a good sense. I'm a child of God. I'm a saint. I'm an ambassador. Those are pretty strong titles. But I'm that because of God. James chapter 4, verse 10 says this, humble yourself before God, and he will lift you up. So we put God first and us last. What Nebuchadnezzar does is he really demonstrates to us in this whole story that we need to humble ourselves instead of resisting God, and we need to place God above us. I want to end with a quote, and then the lesson will be yours. I like this quote a lot. If you start your day on your face before the Lord, there's nowhere to go but up. The man on his face can never fall from that position. I love that. If we start in humility before God and bow and say, you are God, there's nowhere to go. He's going to lift us up. And a man who falls, a man on his face can never fall from that position. And I love that. You think of a prideful man, he's standing up, his nose is up, I'm great. And when he falls with a crash. But how do you fall when your face is to the ground? When I was thinking about that, I thought about a ski trip. We were with the church up in Salida, and we were skiing, and I was skiing behind Jolie. And I was taking care of her and skiing, and she stopped. Well, she fell, is what she did. She fell down, and I skied up beside her and helped her up. I said, are you okay? She goes, yeah, I'm great. And then she just kept on going. I was about to follow her, continue to follow her, and one of the adults skied up to me. I really don't remember who it was. And they said, is she okay? And I said, yeah, she got up, and she just kept on going. And they smiled. They go, hey, John, when you're that small and you fall down, it doesn't hurt. You can get up pretty quick. But when we fall, and it hurts. And they were right, because that day I lost it. I lost every ski, every pole. It hurt. It hurt. I was literally laying in the snow thinking, I'm done. Go ahead, get ski patrol. I don't care. I don't want to do this again. That hurt. I'll never forget that moment. And that's what happens. If we're closer to God and we're bowing down and humbling ourselves before God, yeah, we're going to fall. Well, we're going to make mistakes. We don't fall very far. And so it doesn't hurt and can be picked up very easily. But it's when we let our pride and who we are take over and we're the best. And when we do fall, man, that hurts a lot. And it's really hard to get back up and say, why get back up? Why do I want to try and do this? Why life? It's because we were trying to be in control. Standing strong in a pride-inflated culture begins face down. So church, I would tell you to practice our humility before God. What an incredible chapter. And what I would encourage you to do is to go back over that prayer and the things that we learn about that prayer. This is one of those I'm going to mark in my Bible. And when I want to talk to somebody about coming back to God, I'm going to use this prayer. It's an incredible example to us that when we fall, we can come back to God. God is there, and He'll exalt us once more. I love you. I hope you're enjoying this study. I love some feedback. Give me a call or text me or email me. I hope everything is going well for you. I look forward to seeing some of you on the 17th. And that day is drawing closer and closer. And soon, over time, we'll all be together again. I love you. God loves you. And you're in my prayers every day. Take care. God bless.